So hello, and thank you for joining us at today's FIT Authors Talks. FIT Authors Talks is part of our Love Your Library events series and is an initiative of the FIT Library that brings authors from our community to speak about their work. From photography to fashion illustration, fiction writing to art, these talks encompass a multitude of projects and themes and celebrate creativity. Today, our FIT author is Professor and Chair of English and Communication Studies, Amy Lemmon. She'll read from and answer questions about her book, The Miracles. About Professor Lemmon's poetry, the broken world is made whole by the stately yet playful lines of these masterful poems, whether wrought in received forms like sonnet, sestina, villanelle, invented, indented forms, riffs on famous forebears, or musically crafted free verse. Fearlessly bridging the gap between tradition and artistic innovation, the author moves us forward with her into the unknown to entertain new relationships with herself, her children, and the world. Thank you, Amy, for joining us today, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Jen. I had the pleasure of having Jen as a student in my class, even though she's very advanced as a writer. And so it's really an honor to be invited to be part of this. And thank you to the library. I see Andrea's here. I know Greta was here. Thank you. If there's anyone else from the library, thank you all so much. So I'm going to read some poems. And as poets do, I'll probably talk a little bit about the poems if some context is needed. And then I will have plenty of time for questions. And I really see this as a conversation. I last week was at, from Wednesday till Saturday or Sunday, I was at the AWP, the Association of Writers and Writing Programs, the big creative writing conference. And for the first time since 2020, it was in person, and I did not attend in 2020. So it was the first time I attended since 2019. And it was amazing, and it was really inspiring. And I was not reading or presenting at all. So I took in a lot and found myself very inspired. And so it's also great to have this opportunity. I'll be reading from my book, The Miracles. I just wanted to show the cover, which was designed by an FIT graduate of the graphic design program, Brandon Saloy. And I really loved working with him on this. It was a wonderful experience. And also it was great that my publisher let me find a cover that I really connected with. The poems in this book cover quite a period of time. I do tend to write with some basis in autobiography, or at least an observation. And so the first poem is from 9/11/01. And this is basically my experience that day when I was 3 weeks pregnant, 3 weeks from delivering my daughter, was 8 months pregnant with my daughter. And I was teaching EN 121 at FIT that Tuesday morning. The title comes from the bus, M23, 9/11/01. As we stood at the intersection of Bloomy Nails and Everything Bagels, the crosstown bus approached, the only one running, calzone stuffed and grunting. In 4 weeks, my daughter would slither wet on my belly, turn blue until the nurse turned her pink and laid her on my breast, warm, irretrievable. On the bus, the bulge of her bought me a seat between the Bayesian nanny and the white-haired woman whose appointment at St. Vincent's would have to be rescheduled. We were bound for the east side, the Stuyvesant Town Deli, a line desperate for ham and cheese, minestrone, enormous water bottles. At my friend's apartment, the TV gave the grainy story over and over. I write quite a bit about my daughter, who was diagnosed at birth with Down syndrome. She's 20 years old now. It's pretty incredible how time flies. There also is a poem I'm going to read that's about my son. The blurb about my book mentioned riffs on famous poets, and this is one of those. Galway Kinnell was a wonderful American poet, and he had a famous poem called After Making Love, We Hear Footsteps, um, and about a child, uh, in the house after the couple has made love. And anyway, this is called After Bathing, I Smell Smoke. After Galway Kinnell. For I can rattle the pans while cooking, drop a dish, or run the vacuum in the hallway, and Stella will stay behind her shut door, sleeping or drawing, reading or tending her kennel of stuffed dogs. But let me run the water and swirl in Epsom salts and lavender oil, slide in with a book and coffee, or just recline and soak, eyes closed, reading my own thoughts as they skein out, twining like one of those interlocking wind sculptures gently rotating on a breeze, and she will dash to my room, root out everything most threatening to our mutual safety and tranquility, and as I rise, dripping to reach for the towel, she is pilfering my most secret journal and scrawling stick figures on its pages with my hidden permanent markers, removing every knife and pair of scissors from their secure places. After I have dressed, chased her from my bed, retrieved my vintage edition of Through the Looking Glass, I smell it. Something burnt or burning or just burnt, and on the one uncovered patch of parquet, I see a wooden match, half blackened. And after sniffing every corner and pile, papers, folders, books, clothing waiting to be ignited, satisfied that no spark waits to flame into the heat of our destruction, I take the dead match and say, no, no, never, never, never play with matches, and collapse my arms around her small, solid fireplug body, which softens as she murmurs, sorry, so sorry, Mom, into my shoulder. And I pray that this innocence will not be her downfall, blessing every hair, the animal scent of her bowed head. This is the poem that mentions my son, who right now is an FIT student. This is from a few years ago. And it's very timely because I visited this place just this morning. It's a very important place in our neighborhood called Triborough Physical Therapy. Because it hangs the color of the sky, the sign shouts everywhere. 24th Avenue creaks along, salt-dusted sidewalks with thin, dark patches. Inside, a motto chides, never, ever, ever give up. My son sits in the waiting room, writing information from the routine to the peculiar on a standardized form. He texts, "Are you my primary care provider?" His phone dies. I hesitate. I could stop by and check, but he must begin to handle things. My guidance, a wavering pole's refraction in the rearview mirror of his adulthood. 18 years now of his body, noticing its changes, his mind blooming, all the dark processes I never had control over. My son, I have not forsaken you. Jagged leaf from the father's tree, spring-loaded, he forges the plowed earth of his intellect, turns jaggedly to veer out of control, like the handle that steers this ridiculous metaphor to its inevitable halt. Per instructions, the boy pulls the bar down with both hands, then lets it rise slowly, logging reps I cannot see. This is another one of the riffs on famous poems. There was a famous poem that made the rounds during the pandemic, as sad poems do. It's a poem by Philip Larkin, a 20th century poet, a mid-20th century English poet, called An Arundel Tomb. And it is basically describing a tomb, a 14th century tomb, where a king and a queen, or a lord and a lady are in effigy, where they were buried together. And what I did with my riff poems was I took the first line and the last line of the famous poem, and I played with it a little bit Sometimes I use the form that they use, sometimes not. In this case, I played with the form too. It's called Untuned, after Philip Larkin. Side by side, our faces blurred, the couple that we were laying nightly. Days uncounted, days too sure to end. 3 nights I've dreamed that you came back. 3 times my heart would start to settle in, relieved. And then I'd wake up to the truth. The beds where we lay together, queens and doubles and occasional kings. The basement bedroom in your parents' house, where we fought sotto voce every time. Another trip, another argument. The tension snapped, then eased up by the time we passed the exit for Arundel County. No side-by-side monument will do for us. You can't be set in stone. You're burned to ash. I make my bed with our old flannel sheets. Aubergine, the color of dried blood. Worn even softer now, thin in places. So many skins suspended in their folds. I miss yours, blazing, irreplaceable. The dreams don't bring your scent, your back, your gentle but persistent snore. The nights my coughing sent you to the couch, or you crept in wee houring after work, are just as lost as the foldings up and sighings no effigy of coupledom can hold. What will survive of us, my love? Forgot to mention that the last line of the Larkin poem is, what will survive of us is love, which I think is the thing that has really made it go viral in a lot of times. This is another elegy poem for the lost partner. You'll notice there's some places in my poems. This one is an East Village place. The title is Positively East 4th Street. And what's really sad is that the ice cream place mentioned in it is closed now. I think the pandemic killed it. Positively East 4th Street. After the poetry reading, I stopped by Oddfellows Ice Cream Co. and asked the woman if I should get buttermilk blueberry or lemon meringue pie. He bakes a whole pie to put in it, she tells me reverently. So I buy a cone. It's gone before I get to the train. 20 years ago, you played the Internet Cafe across from the Hells Angels on East 3rd. Parking on that block was difficult, and the guy behind the counter was a jerk, but the jazz was good every night. I always cry for you in the East Village. I have for years now, even back when it was only our marriage that had died. Tonight, though, there are no tears, only ice cream, and there is nothing to compare with the absolute cleanliness of the imaginary, but this is close. The whole pie in the ice cream, every bit as tart and sweet as you expect. This one starts with an image from a dream. And the title is a bit of an homage to Marie Howe has a wonderful book, What the Living Do. And it's full of elegies, I think in that case for her brother. This is called What the Living Say to the Dead. Our 2 young kids were monkey scrambling in my dream, and you, younger than ever, wanted me. We roamed the stone buildings of some ivied campus, working out our future, your apparent death behind us. You would stay with me, with us, and all would be well. Spring lilies were spreading out in the pond, the first rowboats tentatively nosing out onto the water. Shadows alternated with dapples of sun, a buffet at midday, cocktails and crudités at sunset. At bedtime, we tucked ourselves in, as we did so many times, sheets a tangle, when you were ours and I was yours, and the clock struck with no more than the usual sense of dread. The problem with these dreams is that I always awaken. You can't be too clear when it comes to the dead, it seems. They have so much trouble hearing you above the din of everything they now know, the music of the spheres and all the rockers gone before their time, like you, the snowdrop cluster of your love, surprise in the shade of a mossy old oak, the sudden clearing where a lone fawn startles, then turns to follow the doe it has so recently emerged from, steaming and bloody and fierce, hungering for balance, poised for the chase. The next two poems are requests from Jen. Thank you for requesting them. This one is called Well Met. It's a bit of a pun. Imagine it's the museum where you run into him, or getting drinks at the interval of a concert, a free lecture or reception, or under some storefront awning, waiting out a downpour, breathless. He's perfect. Handsome enough, age appropriate, healthy and ready for love and not attached. You share the same credo. Carpe diem with a caveat. Live every day. Read I and thou through the lens of modern relationships. He catches your eye and holds your gaze, takes your hand, you leap, and wham, wait, not that, a softer landing into a decent seat at the opera, and you see that he has already removed his hat and stowed it safely beneath his seat. Breathe. No medic necessary, no heavy drugs, prescription or otherwise. Push the up button on this one. Check the yes box. Run towards, not away, and cancel the call for help. Ditto panic, ditto vague dissatisfaction. Sit back, enjoy the show. This is another one that's in the famous riffs, the riffs on famous poems. This is inspired by a poem by Randall Jarrell, another 20th century, mid-20th century poet. He wrote a series of monologues in the voices of women characters that he closely observed, but he wasn't them, obviously. And this is inspired by a poem called Next Day, which basically the speaker is a woman who's at the grocery store. She's middle-aged and she has had the experience of going to the funeral of a friend the day before. And she is in many ways kind of the classic mid-20th century housewife. This one's called, I figured, speak from an actual woman's perspective, and that's what I did. And what I did when I was writing, I just have to say, from a craft perspective, I drafted the poem. I was inspired by the Jarrell poem. I started with the title, or with the first line and the last line. And then it wasn't until I was in the revision process that I realized that the poem rhymed, that his poem rhymed, and I imitated the form. So that was a lot of fun. It shows how I needed to read a little bit more closely, despite all my education. So his poem famously starts, and it has brand names of household products, moving from cheer to joy, from joy to all. It's a very famous line. And I start with it. Another day. Moving from cheer to joy, from joy to all. I choose the brand with less packaging, ingredients less likely to harm. I add grain-free crackers, local greens, organic chicken, organic eggs, amaranth. Begin to be now, said William James, what you will be hereafter. I must begin to be flatter of belly and narrower of thigh, a fraction indivisible by the lowest common denominator. In the name of health, everybody's selling kale smoothies, cayenne cleanses, grass-fed jerky. When I was young and miserable and thin, I thought I was destined to wear size 6 forever. How often did I undress with someone then? How often lie alone, imagining I was being undressed? I longed and longed till I was made of longing. This new diet targets my demographic. Oh, how I despise counting and measuring out discouraging portions, all the knowing and the careful, careful shopping. I crave compromise, a plan that lets me sneak almond croissants. At my slimmest, I ate the most perfect pastries from a tiny shop near Central Park. After therapy, I'd get my croissant and a large Sumatra with cream and sugar, careful not to drop the phone. No one called, walked to my favorite bench. Dieting is common, but those croissants were extraordinary. The filling, not a paste, but an almost custard, redolent of almonds. The shop is closed now. Rising rent scary. The tired owner sold her recipes to a neighbor. Other middle-aged people annoy me. Their huffings and umbrages, sun hats and hair dye, and showy, pricey spectacles. I am no exception, spending as much as anyone to mask the damages. It costs more and more each day just to go on. I think of the two friends my age, lost last year to cancer, one of the brain and one of the womanly organs, one a 3-month decline, the other a decade's battle. Their daughter and sons bewildered, husbands devoted and diminished. Yesterday, after fasting, I went to the doctor who put me to sleep so he could peek inside and check for tumors. He didn't find anything out of the ordinary, just told me to keep away from chocolate, caffeine, tomatoes, wine, the few things that give pleasure to my days and nights. I am not exceptional, staring at the mirror like a fogged effigy, unclear how one so young can look like that, how one life can, after all, be so confused, so commonplace, so solitary. And the last poem I'm going to read before we open up for questions and a conversation. I love the story behind this poem because those of you who are poets and poetry fans in the audience will know the form, the Villanelle, an ancient French form that involves repetition, iambic pentameter, rhyme. One of the most famous there's a couple really famous ones. One of them is Elizabeth Bishop's poem, One Art, The Art of Losing Isn't Hard to Master. And I found the form very hard to master until I decided to do an exercise with one of my classes. And this is my first completed Villanelle. And I drafted it with my students. And we started, I think we had the word moon, we had like a word bank to start from. So it's called Supermooning. We craned to see the sumptuous supermoon that drizzled on the foggy foreign sky. It burned and sizzled on and on till noon. You called from Massachusetts much too soon. You haven't just moved on. The spellbound try and crane to see the scrumptious supermoon. Emoji hearts don't hold the same balloon. Confetti brings me down. Could that be why it burned and sizzled on and on till noon and stirred the frozen sea? I fought to tune my inner carburetor's wiring guy. We craned to see the unctuous supermoon in separate states, in separate cloud-struck scenes. I didn't press send at first, but by and by, the message burned and sizzled on till noon. When suddenly my heart, that freeze-dried prune, began to thaw and soften. Mollified, we craned to see. Rambunctious supermoon, pray, burn, and sizzle on till long past noon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Amy. That was really great. So we're going to open up the discussion to questions, and please put them in the chat and I'll read them out. I have a few myself that I can start off with. When I read your book, I noticed there are spiritual undertones in many of your poems, and I'd like to know, how does religion and spirituality affect your poetry?
That's a great question. Thank you. My first book was called Saint Nobody, and this one is called The Miracles. So there's religious undertones, I think, in both of them. I mean, I was raised in a very religious home. in fact, of a fundamentalist Christian home, Protestant home. And I myself do not, I'm not in that faith anymore. But there's iconography and there's liturgy and there's music above all that's sort of in the background. The title poem, The Miracles, which I didn't read, it's a little bit longer. It's a 3-part poem. The first part of it actually starts in the cloisters. So I'm very inspired by kind of religious artifacts and the art of, in that case, the Middle Ages, mostly medieval times. And you could see that sort of in the cover. Well, this is a better version. That one's very battered. You can sort of see that in that. So
Okay. So, going into the musicality of it, your sections are named Fugue, Riff A, Riff B, and Coda, and you use musical terms in other places. Why did you use musical terms to organize your sections?
if I weren't a poet, I would be a musician. I would have been a musician. I used to be a musician. I am like a recovering musician. I wish I could be a musician. I wish I could do everything, right? I love music. I played several instruments growing up and as a young adult. And when I was finally putting this manuscript together, it was actually just before Easter. It was like Easter Eve. And I basically had a general sense of the order, kind of groupings of poems. That's kind of how you put things together by theme. And I just wasn't quite sure how to put it all together. And I came across a piece by Leonard Bernstein, who's like one of my favorites. I know everybody knows West Side Story, of course, because it just got the Oscar and everything. But as I say in the note, the structure of the book was inspired by Leonard Bernstein's Prelude, Fugue, and Riffs, 1949, for solo clarinet and jazz ensemble. And I got the idea of riff. I didn't write that blurb that you read. Somebody else did that, but I mean, riff is something. It's like a variation on a theme. It's not a formal variation on a theme, but the piece that it's that I was inspired by is actually a classical, sort of concert piece inspired by jazz. And I realized I sort of was Googling and kind of found this piece. And then I realized later that I had had a recording of it when I was in my 20s. And it was a very challenging piece for me at the time because I was used to like swing music and more romantic music. And it was a performance by Benny Goodman, who was a jazz and swing clarinetist, and it was a classical piece. So I realized I had like a specific tie to that. And it just worked out really well with the kind of number of sections that I had and the way that I wanted to put it together. So I, you know, it, it was one of those aha moments where you solve a problem, a creative problem. I'm sure there's many people in the audience who've experienced that. And it's always when you don't think you're ever going to figure it out that you do.
Hmm, that's really interesting. As an aside question, what instruments did you play?
Uh-huh. Oh, piano, violin, oboe, trumpet. I taught myself enough guitar to write like a song.
Wow.
Um, but yeah, I read music. I mean, took piano lessons from when I was 5 or 6, and I actually started as a music major in undergrad and switched to English. And then when I was in graduate school, I played violin in a contra dance band, so I played folk music, but sort of haven't kept up with it. And it's one of those things, if you don't keep it up, it kind of, you have to get back into it. But I sing in the shower. That's what I in the car.
Yeah, that's funny. Let's see. You write about different kinds of love in this book, from your children to your former husband to possibly another person. Which is the hardest to write about?
I would say that the erotic or romantic love is probably the easiest to write about because there's the most of a tradition. I mean, Shakespeare, everybody has done those poems. And I think that in those moments when someone is enamored of a person, you feel very inspired and lyrical, you know. Writing about the kids is it's tough, you know. And one of the things that comes up, and there was one of the panels at AWP that was it was basically focusing on this anthology of poems about motherhood. And one of the questions that comes up for me, especially with my daughter, is, you know, as people become adults, as children become adults, would they want you to write about them? What do you write about them? So that can be very, very tricky. I mean, I think also in terms of the lost love, the elegy is a long tradition as well. So that I did have a pattern to follow in a lot of ways, even though the situation was, of course, unique. Um, but yeah, I do think that it's challenging to write about my children. It was, at least when I first started doing it, but I felt really strongly connected to that. And also, one thing that I have to say, um, there are a lot more books of poems about motherhood and about parenting, and not just mothers, but all stripes of parents. And it when I first was doing this, like in the aughts, it was kind of a thing. Like you were sort of making a statement if you were writing mom poems, and there was some gatekeepers in the poetry world that were kind of pushing back against that and didn't think it was so great. Um, and Catherine Barnes, you could probably speak a little bit about that too. I remember that, she says. Yeah, my colleague and friend Catherine Barnes was in the trenches with that. We're both part of a listserv, a group of poets called the Poet Moms, and the whole reason that the listserv was created was because poets who were also mothers felt that they really needed a space to connect.
That's great. That's really great. Let's see. What do you enjoy about writing poetry as opposed to other forms of writing? What drew you to poetry?
I have more experience, I would say, with poetry, just overall, just because I've devoted most to it. I mean, when I was really little, my first writing experience, I remember writing poems. And I think partly it was because I was read nursery rhymes and other poems and children's poems. And I remember I was like maybe 8 years old, and I still have these poems written somewhere, and I illustrated them. I thought I could draw too, but I sort of realized that visual art was not my thing. And there was an experience that I had where I was looking at a stand of trees, and it was November. You know how there's that gray, and it was kind of like the sky was kind of whitish gray and just starting to get cold. And I really wished that if I could do watercolor or some kind of charcoal drawing, I probably would have done that. But instead, I wrote about it, you know, and that was when I was a little bit older, more like 11 or 12. But I also wrote plays, I wrote short stories. I was very influenced by Louisa May Alcott. I remember I did a play based on her biography. Um, you know, I did all kinds of stuff, satirical things, you know. I tried a little teeny bit of journalism. I've also done memoir and creative nonfiction. I've done a little bit of fiction. Um, you know, I mean, I wouldn't say there's anything, one is easier than the other. They're all pretty, you know, writing is writing. It's, you know, no matter how long you've been doing it, it's still the blank page that you're facing, you
Yeah.
know. I wanted to show, if it's okay, I wanted to show a little bit. I show this to my students when I do little videos for them at the beginning of my online class. Some of the different ways that poems start or that pieces start. Um, some people may be familiar with morning pages from Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way, and this is the battered
Yes.
notebook that I use for those, where you just write 3 longhand pages of blah, blah, blah to get um, working or playing or whatever. But then I also have a decomposition book. Do you guys know this? I love the decomposition books. They're really, really beautiful. There's
Hmm.
all different covers and everything. But I have things stuck in here. This is the kind of book that I will use when I think I have a poem or maybe an essay, you know, kind of a piece of memoir. This was something I did, like a creative activity that I did. Um, oh, and you could see I'm like, poem for a birthday, Plath. This makes me sad because the pandemic has changed my process. I'm a coffee shop poet. I love nothing better than to go to a coffee shop. And this is, I can see where I was like at a place and I wrote down the name of the place. You read a little bit, you journal a little bit, and then maybe you start drafting. Um, and then I might type it up into a Google Doc, and then I'll print it out and write on it and, correct it that way. Um, that's usually how it works for me. Although also will sometimes draft using the Notes app on my phone. I know a lot of my students are doing that. I sometimes start with Google Docs. Um, I like to write in groups with people and use prompts and get generative stuff going on. I see a lot of really good questions in the chat, so I want to make sure we have time for those too.
Yeah, so we've got more comments than questions. When you're enamored by a person, it's so easy to write about. So true. Not a question, but wanted to state that the subjects you write are not only moving, but easily relatable. Thank you for your sensitivity.
Thank you,
Um,
Sanjita.
and then this is just wanted to say this is so interesting. Who triumphs, takes a back seat, the mom or the writer? What windows into their life of the child would be comfortable with the mom opening? It gives me much to think about as my child turns 15 this year.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to have a sabbatical a year from now for a semester, and also I'm going to be doing a residency for 4 weeks this summer, which is really thrilling. I've never been able to do that. And one of the reasons I'm able to do this, the um, the residency in particular, is that my daughter Stella is in residential school right now, and will be most likely moving into a residential group home after she turns 21 next year. We're kind of in the process of doing that, and a lot of people here know that we had a very hard time during the pandemic with her behavior, and she's doing much better in the setting where she's got a lot of care and it's a great place. And they love her. She's very lovable, but it's also a challenge. And so that's going to be a really, really, it's a bit daunting for me, actually. I kind of did this thing where I wrote this proposal and I'm like, oh, now I have to do it. But, I'm basically looking into the history of Down syndrome, the history of residential care, which is a very fraught history. Um, and in addition to completing my third full-length collection of poems, we'll be hopefully doing some essays and possibly some, scholarly work with some historical research about these subjects. But it will always be, I imagine, it will always be grounded in experience and in a memoiristic approach, sort of as a jumping off point. I'm really drawn to other writers who do that kind of work because I have a lot of role models, I think, now out there. There's a lot of hybrid work, hybrid genres where it's a little bit lyrical, but it has some historical research, or maybe it's incorporating dialogue, but it's, expressing an emotion, or there are different kinds of forms that are used. Writers are doing a lot of different things these days, and I'm looking forward to exploring.
Nice. So you're working on your third book of poetry.
Hmm.
So are you close to finishing that or in the middle of it or?
Oh, we'll find out this summer when I actually have time to focus on it. Yes, Andrea, I do write essays, and that's kind of what I'm talking about. Like, I'm really trying to go more towards that. Yes, and creative nonfiction is a great space for poets to transition to and to go back and forth. I actually was asked to write an essay for a collection about um, writers for whom writing is part of their self-care kind of wellness practice, and it was like right in the zone of what I teach and what I do and what I'm interested in researching. So that's another aspect that I'm looking into, is actual research on that has been done about writing, healing, writing, creativity. Some people know I teach a course on the creative imagination and creativity. Um, I think I lost the thread of the question that I was, but yeah, so the collection of poems, that's what you're talking about. Yeah, I have about 50 pages in draft, but they may not all end up, it's kind of that thing where I was writing poems, and it's been a few years.
Yeah.
Because I think these poems, I think the last poem in the Miracles, the latest I would have been drafting might have been 2018, because that's when the book was accepted for publication. And then it was more like revising and kind of arranging and polishing and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Any more questions?
What's the editing process like?
Do I throw away a lot when I'm drafting? And what's the editing process like? Those are great questions. They're connected. I like to say this to my students, and I really believe it for myself. Revision is writing. And I've gotten to the point where I actually really enjoy the revision process, because that's where you can kind of make things work, click things together in ways that they might not have been. I love when I can do that, especially sometimes it's years after I've drafted a poem. And in fact, the title poem, The Miracles, was just the third part. It was just one part, and it was kicking around since at least the aughts. Because I remember I was at the Sewanee Writers Conference in 2009, and I was in a workshop, and I had that poem in the workshop. And then during my previous sabbatical in 2016, I drafted a couple other sections, and wow, but it took a lot of revision. I remember there's a poem in my first book, which came out in 2009. Some of those poems went back to my graduate school days. Like, that was my first book. It's kind of like the group's first album. It's like your whole life put into
Wow.
that up to that point. I would say I probably don't, when you say throw away a lot, like, I think it's more like putting it aside. It's more like, and with an individual poem, I might cut lines and move things around. Um, but sometimes you draft something and it's just, well, that's in that folder. You don't really have to do anything with it. You don't necessarily send it out or put it in a collection or something like that.
Mm.
Just so you know, I have a sensor, and the light keeps turning off. That's why I have to go like this.
Mine used to do
People
that
who've been
too.
in meetings with me know, because I have the same problem in my office.
Yeah. Mine does the same thing. Um, so the next question is kind of like a two-part question, and it's what was your favorite part of the whole process of creating this book, and then what was the most difficult part?
My favorite part was the publisher accepting it. No, I mean, that was a great time. That was a really nice time. Um, that's always a good thing, but it isn't the best thing. I mean, I think the best thing, I have to say, I think that moment I described earlier where I came across the Bernstein piece and figured out the solution to the organization, that was my favorite moment. It really was. Um, and what was the second part? I'm sorry.
What was the most difficult part of the process?
All of it. Yeah. I mean, again, I had that poem, The Miracles, and I didn't have much else. And I kind of thought, well, this would be a great title for my next book. But if you don't have other stuff,
Yeah.
then that's just it. And I wasn't sure, like that kind of uncertainty, until I was able to generate and draft some more. Um, and because we all work really hard at FIT, there isn't always the kind of brain space to do that. And, that's basically when you kind of are daunted and think, oh, this isn't ever going to happen. So that's helpful.
Nice. Nice, nice. Are there any other questions for Amy?
Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is really nice to see everyone here.
No, it's nice to have you.
Creative nonfiction. I have taught it. It's been a while. I probably will teach it again. I first started teaching it in, hi, Sarah Fruner. Thanks for coming. We have some mutual friends, I think. Um, I just wanted to say that I first taught creative nonfiction in the year 2000 when I started full time. For years, that course was the requirement for freshmen in the honors program, and it was wonderful. And some of my students, they're still in touch, and they're really truly grown up now. So it makes me feel a little old, but thank you, everybody. Thank you, Leslie. I know this is an odd time, and there's a union meeting at 7 o'clock. Everybody wants to get home for that who are union members. Leslie. I love the chat. Thanks so much, everybody,
Yeah.
for chatting so much.
So, if
Yeah.
there are no further questions, thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you, Jen. I'm really, really honored to be invited, and I'm looking forward. I mean, I think most people here know me, and you can certainly reach out if you wanted to ask individual questions, but I really appreciate the opportunity to share. And I
Thank
wish
you.
everyone creativity and a wonderful evening.
Oh, great.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
coming, Paula. Hey.
So, for more information on FIT authors or how to submit to be featured, go to the website at authors.fitnyc.edu. You can also follow us on Instagram for info on upcoming FIT authors talks at FIT NYC Library. So thanks everybody for joining us and have a great evening.
Thank you so much. Is it okay if I just put in the chat for people who
Sure.
are still here? I'm hosting an event tomorrow with
Oh,
another poet at 1 o'clock. So if anybody's interested in hearing David Mills read from his book Bone Yarn, Poems About the History of Slavery in NYC, and he's someone who's done archival research, which I really admire. So I
oh,
just thought I'd put that in there.
yeah,
Just give a little plug. Thank you again.
yes, thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.